Hi, welcome everyone. Welcome to the Fraud Technology Podcast. We have with us Brian Siegel today. We had a chance to talk to Brian a few months ago. Unfortunately, we lost the recording, but we are so happy and thankful to Brian to join back again. Welcome to the podcast, Brian. Nice to see you here.
Nice to see you again, Ravi.
Awesome. And just to give a short introduction of Brian itself, Brian is the global head of fraud risk at Barclays, and he has about almost 3 decades of experience in the risk space and the last 10 years, especially in the fraud space itself. So that's a wealth of experience that a lot of us could benefit from listening to his insights in the industry itself. Welcome again, Brian.
Yep, thank you.
Yeah, so just to start, so I wanted to understand because I think in the last 1 2 years there's been a humongous growth in fraud itself. So I wanted to understand what is essentially driving fraud today.
That's a great question, and one we we would probably need 3 hours on our podcast to go through. There's so many factors, but when I really think about it, there are three main drivers for me, right? And the first one is ease of entry for the fraudsters,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
The sophistication and availability of tools,
Hmm.
fraud as a service,
Hmm.
are making the ability for people who might not have had the technical expertise you used to have need to have
Yeah.
uh, to make this behavior easier, right? Data breaches, availability of PII data,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
That's the first one. The second one is what I call the need for speed.
Hmm.
And as we shift to faster transactions, quicker, better customer experience, fraudsters are learning to exploit these processes,
Hmm.
right, for their gain. So, for example, like in Europe with faster payments, instant settlements,
Yeah.
unless there's a robust fraud detection program,
Hmm.
it's going to be impossible to recover those funds, right?
Yeah.
And then the third big one is really customer education,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Um, customers Customer education needs to be improved. Customers need to be better aware of fraudulent signs, particularly around scams, particularly around how they secure their mobile devices, how they secure their tablets and things of that nature.
Yeah.
I don't think we as an industry are doing as good a job as we can.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
those are really the three big ones that I see as a driver.
Awesome, awesome. Actually, that touches a lot of nerve for me because I do have questions specific to each of them as well. So one, I think you did talk a little bit about fraud as a service, and I've heard about this before. Would love to understand what this essentially means.
Sure. So what this is there are organizations, people out there, what have you, that will provide you with the tools necessary to commit fraudulent activity,
Yeah.
specifically financial fraud.
Mm.
So if you want, or even cyber fraud, like a denial of service attack or something,
Yeah.
there are organizations that will give you the coding necessary, will give you detailed instructions how to embed this coding. They will give you, for credit card fraud, you can purchase card readers and cloning devices.
Mm.
They're even as sophisticated as they have call centers with help desk
Yeah.
lines.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm.
it used to be in the earlier years of credit card fraud, right, in the 80s and 90s,
Mm.
you had to be fairly technical to
Mm.
be able to pull off something,
Like this. Mm.
to defraud an organization like a bank.
Mm.
Today, you just need to be smart enough to follow a list of instructions.
Mm.
So it's definitely something to be aware of,
Mm.
right? It's
Mm.
anyone can do it,
Yep, yep. I
unfortunately.
remember seeing. I think last year there was somebody who in the UK who was arrested because he was managing a SaaS platform essentially for fraudsters to buy, let's say in the US, SSN data essentially. Because you cannot buy like a
That's right.
10 million data set, you want to buy like 1,000 and see whether such a fraud modus operandi works
That's
or
correct.
not, right? So that was pretty interesting, and I think most of the people don't know how easy it is for a fraudster to actually access these tools itself, right?
I
Mm.
Yeah, I think you're spot
Mm.
on. I think
Mm.
people need to realize that it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when their data will be compromised or somebody will attempt that, right?
Mm.
All of our data is out there, particularly here in the
Mm.
US with all the data breaches, and
Mm.
but we see this worldwide.
Mm.
we can go on and get your personal information, my personal information, and pay, maybe a few US dollars for it, right?
Yeah.
We can do it in about 10 minutes if we wanted to. So yeah, I think
Mm.
you're spot on.
Yeah, I think the going rate for now for SSN from the US is apparently $10 to $10 to $15 per SSN that you buy in these platforms. So telephone numbers and emails are much cheaper. You can buy them at like $1 or two basically per person. Awesome.
That's right.
So you also talked about the second point was about need for speed. That sounds like the game that you play, but essentially the
That's
expectation
right.
of customers that we want the services to be fast, right? Now at the same time,
Correct.
you need the fraud also to be in real time as well to be able to counter that, right? So and
Right.
the expectation are not tampering down, right? I mean, it's getting even more and more demanding from the customers, and the market is also getting very competitive. So how do you manage this balance? Because the more fraud controls you have, the more friction you have, which goes against the
Correct.
customer experience objectives that you are going with. So how do you balance these two um, uh, conflicting
It's
priorities?
not
As
easy.
yeah. Mm,
Yeah, I look at, and that's the key word,
mm,
conflicting.
mm,
It's not easy to do,
mm,
right? You can, I tell my CROs all the time, I can guarantee you no fraud loss for the bank. I
mm,
can guarantee it, zero. We'll also have zero customers, zero revenue. There has to be that balance, like you said,
mm,
and the way we do that is the best way to do that is to have a partnership with the business, right? We need to be aware of their roadmap. Hey, here's where we're looking to take our customer experience: faster payments, quicker application processes. And it's then behooving on the risk teams, but particularly the first line teams, to be able to then start to build the technology or to enhance our technology to be able to keep up with that,
mm,
right? And so that comes down to resources,
mm,
right? And that's a big constraint
mm,
for a lot of people, and that's again that balance, right?
mm,
you have to be able to keep up
mm, mm.
with the technology.
Understand. And how do you manage this in a large organization like Barclays? Because I mean, your expectation of customer experience is fairly standard across the globe. Everyone wants it in instantly real time payment. I mean, US is still a little
Of course.
behind in that customer experience, but the rest of the world pretty much is in real time payments ecosystem, right? So and because such a
Right.
large company with so many different countries, so many different risks that you have, how do you manage that in a large company like Barclays?
Well, the way you manage it is, number one is communication, right? We need to understand where the goals are of the business. Like I mentioned, partnership with the business, communication,
Mm,
but it's a two-way street, right? It's We can't have customer experience being the most important thing, right,
mm,
above all others. And it's the same thing with fraud prevention. We can't keep all of the doors locked.
mm,
There needs to be a balance,
mm,
right? And there's
mm,
you need to have that conversation, right? So, for example, faster payments. That's starting to come along, as you know, here in the U.S. But like you said, outside of the U.S., that's been
mm,
the standard for quite some time, or at least the bigger part of it.
mm,
And that's being okay. So
mm,
we have instant settlement.
mm,
So then that means, what is our pre-settlement fraud controls?
mm,
Are they adequate enough to be able to catch? Won't catch everything,
mm,
but are you going to be able to catch the majority of fraud? Right. So
mm,
it can't be like in the old days when you would catch something you weren't sure, and then you wanted to delay the payment.
mm,
You can't do that,
mm,
right? In that case,
mm,
so you needed to be able to focus there. So again, that goes back to communication.
mm,
It goes back to understanding the plan that your stakeholders have
mm.
and being able to put something into place, having the resources to put something into place.
Awesome. And the last point that you talked about in the trends to increase the fraud itself was around customer education itself, right? So I want to combine this question with something else, which is on the APP fraud in the UK itself. So the UK regulations for came up for PSPs in December last year, saying that you have to reimburse whenever somebody claims that they have been a victim of APP fraud. So this goes a little bit counterintuitive to customer education, because I could be naive and I don't need to be educated to claim that I've been a because I have no loss essentially, right? Because I will be reimbursed if I can prove,
Right,
right? So how do you
right.
and I mean, I'm personally again, you can correct me here. Is my view is that such regulations are probably going to be a mainstay in majority of the countries. They started in the UK, but most of the countries are likely to adopt something like that, right? So when that happens, right, one is customer education. You want to teach them that you have to be cautious, but on the other hand, there is no incentive for them to learn, right? Because you're going to 100% immerse, right? How is this going to play out?
Well, I think the way this is going to play out is, ultimately, that's where the PSR is moving, like you called out, that it's going to a prevent or pay model,
Yeah.
right? And
Mm.
and we'll see more, as it gets implemented in Q4 of this year.
Mm.
But I think the important thing is, look, customers don't want to go through this in the first place,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
The banks have to be able to show that we have provided that, hey, are you sure you want to make this payment?
Mm-hmm.
This is going to someone you've never done business with. There are certain things the bank is putting into place.
Mm-hmm.
But I think if we can get the customers educated enough,
Mm.
right, that they can sort of help themselves, right? Yes, ultimately, if we prove that we couldn't prevent this, then we're going to reimburse. But
Mm.
I don't think there are many people that are going to want to do it in the first place,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
So
Mm.
that also helps us. That helps our prevention process, right? We're really helping, the banks are helping themselves with that.
Mm.
Not only the customer, it's everybody wins,
Mm.
right? So,
Mm.
if somebody calls you up and has a great investment
Mm.
opportunity, all we need is,
Mm.
£1 million,
Mm.
in cash, or something ridiculous
Mm.
like that. Well, maybe to take a second step,
Mm.
call your bank, talk about it.
Mm.
I think that just sort of helps the general environment, but it is going to be challenging. I won't say that it won't be,
Mm.
because I think
Mm.
it'll be a very challenging process, not just for fraud, but then you have,
Mm.
um,
Mm.
money laundering, money mules, things of that nature too, is going to get very difficult.
I understand, understand. So, for example, I mean, I wanted to add, I want to understand a little bit more on that one. Is, for example, let's say somebody asked me, "Hey, Ravi, invest $1,000 every month in this particular scheme, and you're gonna get, let's say, triple the money by the end of the year, something like that, right?" Previously, I used to. There is a saying which goes by, if it is hard to believe, then it's probably not true, right? So I will always have that common sense. But when I have a safety net that I can always go back and say, "Hey, this was fraud. This was APP fraud because he convinced me that this would give me three times. I didn't realize at the time." So when it takes away when it provides that safety net, I may become a little more risk prone. I may take that risk because I have a safety net now. So there is this
You
um,
might.
conversation in the market when this particular regulation came in about, saying that this incentivizes fraud rather than it stops fraud. So I wanted to understand how banks see it itself.
Well, at least for us, the bank's responsibility is to protect their customers. That's number
Yeah.
one. And I think they're certainly trying to do that, right? All banks are trying to do that,
Hmm.
and they're doing that in a lot of different ways. So, if you're gonna make that payment and it gets flagged, and we're looking at it going, huh, is that? And we contact you and say, Ravi, are you sure you want to do this? And you say, oh, yeah, absolutely. I'm going to get triple my investment. And we say, well, that's a very difficult thing to be able to do. The market only averages X, and
Hmm.
you're talking about what we would advise caution, and and then if you say, no, 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 I'm going to do this, right, and you move forward,
Hmm.
obviously,
Hmm.
I think the banks need to show that we're trying to help you,
Okay.
right?
Hmm.
I think that's the important part for us,
Hmm.
to be able to make that claim that,
Hmm.
hey, we did all we could. Look, at the end of the day, it's going to be the customer's decision what to do with their money,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Hmm. Hmm.
That's everybody's right.
Hmm.
But I think
Hmm.
if the bank is able to provide enough information to make you think twice about it,
Hmm.
right? I think that could help.
Hmm.
Look, is it going to prevent all of it?
Yeah.
No.
Hmm.
Is it going to help some customers?
Hmm.
Absolutely. I mean, there's always going to be people, to your point, going,
Hmm.
I'll just tell them it was fraud, right? There are people that believe that way, but
Hmm.
the majority of people really want to do the right thing.
Hmm.
They really don't want to gamble.
Yeah.
People understand how hard it is
Hmm.
to, earn money.
Hmm.
They don't want to let it go as easy. So I think you are going to, for the majority,
Hmm.
that education is going to help, and some of the stuff that the bank is trying to prevent is going to be beneficial.
Okay, okay. I think so. One, you talked about protecting the customer, which is the main objective of the behind the regulation itself. I agree. The second one was about providing that education so that the customer can make that call, because at the end of the day, it's their call. Okay, fair point. I understand. So I also noticed that with this particular regulation, right, there is a very specific fraud regulation. which comes into now compliance and fraud itself. Now, for fraud, you are supposed to do comply basically. Typically, compliance departments have been predominantly AML. Fraud has been typically more bottom line, or which impacts the business itself directly. Compliance has been more like, I need to show my
Hmm.
auditability and explainability to my regulator, right? So now, when these regulations come in, I was
Sure.
wondering, because fraud and compliance are now getting merged, how are banks or PSPs preparing to comply to this?
You know, I always look at fraud and AML as just right next to each other,
Yeah.
right? They're
Mm,
they're just they're so close, right? There's a different focus, like you said, particularly, AML is concerned with, money coming in, money coming out. Fraud is a little bit more focused on loss to customers, loss to the bank,
mm,
but a lot of the same data, a lot of the same analysis sort of goes together. So
mm,
I think it's a natural progression,
mm,
and it's something that they've been doing for a while, right? Sort of sharing information and things of that nature.
mm,
It's just for a different goal, right?
mm,
So
mm,
what the AML folks in compliance, like to your point
mm,
around the regulators and things like that. But
mm,
I think banks will start to prepare to say, look,
mm,
what kind of interaction do we have?
mm,
Where do the touch points in the
mm,
processes?
mm,
And if we don't have them, then we better get them, right?
mm,
That's
mm.
that's where I think they need to focus.
Yeah, understand. So predominantly, the compliance teams and fraud teams have been different, right? Traditionally. In,
In some banks,
mm,
in some banks, I'm aware of some banks that it's fraud is in compliance, right,
oh,
along with AML. Sometimes they're
mm,
broken out, right. There could be different operating
mm,
models. Now, the individual groups, like I said, have different
mm,
narrow little goals, but in general,
mm,
it's the same bit of information, right? So
mm,
if the fraud team is picking up on
mm,
account
mm,
takeovers and increases in
mm,
uh, you know, um,
mm,
deposit applications, for example,
mm,
the AML team is going to want to know all about that as well, because what are they doing that for? The fraudsters are
mm,
opening up these deposit accounts to then move money through and then out,
mm,
right? So
mm,
there should be natural collaboration through both teams, and if there isn't, then
mm.
that's something that group needs to work on.
Understand, understand. I remember in my previous role where I was doing KYC. KYC is a compliance requirement, but KYC also had a lot of elements of anti-fraud itself. Because if you're doing sanctions, there is
Right.
also sanctions evasion, which typically has fraud elements into it as well. That I am pretending to be somebody else to get into the system, which goes into fraud
Sure.
as well as sanctions itself. Okay, that reminds me that yes,
That's right.
I think it has always been there. It's just that traditionally have been different teams, but I guess the interaction would
That's
increase
right.
going forward.
That's right.
Awesome. I also want to understand how your fraud modeling, the machine learning, or the data within a large bank like Barclays is structured. For example, different countries may have one different products, obviously, and also you may have different data coming in, and different markets also have different external data sources as well. So you may have a very disparate requirements from business units. I know you talked about talking to business units and being in sync with what the business teams want. But with a company like as big as Barclays, you will have so many different business units. How do you, one, there is benefit in centralizing it because you can then learn a lot of things and cross leverage a lot of techniques that you have developed. But at the same time, you also need to be specific to each of the businesses itself. So, how do you manage this centralization
Right.
versus customization to each of the businesses itself?
Yeah, it's not easy,
Mm,
right? And I think you were hitting all the high points there.
mm,
You have different regions with different data
mm,
requirements. You also have, different privacy laws. There
mm,
in certain regions, you can only take data from customers, certain data points versus others.
mm,
And I think it comes down to where are your risks
mm,
and your requirements, right? So
mm.
it's always good to share data, right? The ultimate setup, at least for me, would be one single data lake. I know we hear that term a lot, a
Yeah.
data lake.
Hmm.
Everything goes into the data lake, all the data from login to payment. Anytime a customer interacts with you, you'd want to get all of that together.
Mm,
And I think that's probably the
mm,
the ultimate goal, particularly of our data scientists.
uh-huh,
I wouldn't want to speak for them,
mm,
but I think it's about, as we move towards that, right, which will take time, it's about risks. Where are your key risks, right? So
mm,
my risk, I'll just make it up. My risk is in
mm,
application fraud, right? A lot of, well, okay, do we have the right amount of authentication? Like, what's our authentication process look like? Do we have the right data points?
mm,
Are we validating customer identity correctly?
mm,
Well, we're not. Okay, do we need to be pulling in, to your point, right?
mm,
KYC,
mm,
more from the compliance side.
mm,
Are there more data points we need to pull in there? I
mm,
think it's about looking at it risk based
mm,
to address your key risks. Do you have enough data for that?
mm,
So that to me is more tactical.
mm,
And then the strategic view is exactly what you were saying.
mm,
And we were talking here about
mm,
having everything all together, right? That's
mm,
that's definitely a goal. I think it's, look, there's resources, there's
mm,
different, and you said disparate systems, regulations, but
mm,
we can, I'm sure, move that way. But I think it's
mm,
right now for us,
mm.
right, or at least the way I would say it is, it's risk based.
Understand, understand. And also, with your experience, not just in Barclays, like over the last 10 years in fraud, and probably even previous to that, right? Can I understand what is a framework that you use in fraud prevention itself? Is there a framework that you use that has worked very well for you?
Right. So, for I'll take a step away from Barclays. I have experience on the merchant side,
Hmm.
implementing and running fraud departments, investigations, analytics, things of that nature. And I think the framework is, to me, it's sort of pretty simple, right? There's a couple things. Number one, and it's what we were talking about before, balance between customer experience and fraud prevention, right? You need to find that right balance.
Mm-hmm.
How much, it's all about appetite. How much appetite does your business, your leaders have for loss
Mm-hmm.
versus their customer experience? That's number one.
Mm-hmm.
Number number two is, right, risk-based assessments, right? Do we know where our pain points are, right? So I used to work for SiriusXM, which is a US-based satellite radio company, very similar to like Spotify, but Sirius was US-based. So the big pain point at SiriusXM is credit card fraud, right? They were predominantly a card not present merchant,
Mm-hmm.
so we were very concerned with card fraud. So we know what the top risks are for card fraud, or what we're concerned with. Are we mitigating those risks, right?
Mm-hmm.
The other one, the two more. The third one is, are we leveraging our tools and platforms ad- adequately, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you have a fraud decisioning engine, you have device ID, biometrics, whatever it is. Do we have it leveraged correctly? Are we using the right tools in the right way, the
Mm-hmm.
right data?
Mm-hmm.
And then that goes to the last one, is analytics. Do you have the data to be able to have a constant process of review and improvement, right? So
Mm-hmm.
do you know what a good customer looks like? Do you know what a good day looks like from a transaction perspective?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have real-time analytics, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think you need to have all of those things working in tandem
Mm-hmm.
to be able to have a successful framework. That's sort of how I think about it.
Wonderful, wonderful. That's really helpful, Brian. So I also wanted to touch on one of the points that you talked about was about business units have a objective, like from a growth point of view. Uh, I want to grow this much for this year, and then they probably have a budget for loss as well when they are making that business plan itself. Right now, when I see
Sure.
the FTC data and even data from outside as well, is that the number of fraud is not growing. The instances of fraud is not growing as much as the value of the fraud, right? Even if one fraud happens, there is a much bigger value of loss that is actually happening, or average loss is actually increasing, right? So in such a scenario, has there been issues of budgets being overshot? Like, for example, I'm assuming that, for example, I remember this case from 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. A Hong Kong financial employee was brought into a Zoom call, and then all other employees were actually deepfakes, and then he was asked to transfer about $20 million, right? So while
Yep.
the overall business may not have more than average fraud, but there may be one or two specific business units, just by chance, because the number is not high but the amount is higher, and it so overshoots your budget system. So has this been a problem, or is it
Yep.
a manageable problem at the moment?
Look, I think it's just constantly evolving,
Hmm.
right? And it's funny that you mentioned that deep fake because I read that same article and I was, just shocked, and it's horrifying really to think about
Yeah,
just how easy they can do
yeah.
that. But what the way I look at it is I think fraud is constantly evolving, right? It's also, we always say it's like water; it always finds its lowest level,
Mm,
and you close off one area, and then they'll circle back and figure something else out. And
mm,
we you can see a spike in your credit card fraud, to your point, but then maybe your deposits fraud has dropped off to nothing. They're constantly moving.
mm,
I know, speaking with my peers in the industry,
mm,
they have been there has been an increase in check fraud,
mm,
within, not for Barclays,
mm,
but for our peers
mm,
in the US.
mm,
In the US,
mm.
they've been dealing with a lot of those issues, and it's sort of surprising. You think about it, you say, well, who writes checks anymore?
Yeah.
Plenty of people do,
Mm,
right? And
mm,
um, the fraudsters are pivoting, right? So,
mm,
maybe a bank has spent a lot of time and money on
mm,
implementing or upgrading their authentication process for credit cards, or and they've put in biometrics, and they got rid of one-time passcodes, and they're using push notification, whatever they're doing.
mm,
They've got it to where they think, hey, we're best in class.
mm,
Now the fraudsters are going back a little bit more old school,
mm,
and they're attacking checks, right? So,
mm,
manually adjusting checks,
mm,
fake checks,
mm, mm,
pulling things out of the mail, things like that. So
mm.
I think it's a cycle, right? And you have to be constantly vigilant, and that's where your data and your monitoring comes from.
Awesome, awesome. There is this framework that I by education, I'm an aerospace engineer, so I do know a lot of risk models within the aviation industry. So they have something called the Swiss cheese model. They have layers of cheese, Swiss cheese.
Okay.
Swiss cheese has holes basically, right? So each risk control that you have, it can go to fraud at any of the risk controls, right? So let's say fraud control, you have one fraud control, it has holes in it, and so you have multiple layers to be able to protect yourself from risk. And you have fraud when all the holes in the different layers kind of align. And I always imagine you use the analogy of water, and then where it tries to figure out the lowest point, right? I always keep imagining that the fraudsters are trying to keep poking holes at each of them, and then finding which one actually goes through, and then try to make it put your
That's
finger
right.
and you make
Yeah,
it bigger and bigger, right? And until somebody comes up and puts another control,
that's it.
right. So I love that
That's
Swiss cheese analogy. It's very visual for me, at least, when you're thinking about controls itself. So you also talked a little bit about a merchant fraud. I remember you are also part of a merchant risk council. Would love to understand what the responsibility of this team itself. Is it most predominantly fraud, or is it a generic merchant risk itself?
It's so I would say the Merchant Risk Council, which I think is a fantastic organization. They're focused on payments,
Hmm.
fraud, chargebacks.
Hmm.
That's really their space.
Hmm.
They put on conferences both in the U.S. and in Europe.
Hmm.
And the reason I think it's a wonderful organization is because it gets people like us
Hmm.
together, and sharing ideas, which is not something we do very well
Hmm.
in
Hmm.
general, right?
Hmm.
You're able to sit down and have a cup of coffee or a cup of tea with someone, and who has your job, or 10 people that have your jobs, and say, well, what are you seeing in terms of fraud? Well, we're seeing this sort of fraud vector. And you think to yourself, wow, I never even knew that.
Hmm.
So you're learning new things, you're sharing ideas. I think it's a really great. They have education, they put on webinars and things like that. I think
Hmm.
there needs to be more of that. It really is, right? Because
Hmm.
we really are. I know it sounds,
Hmm.
we are all in this together,
Yep.
right? So,
Hmm.
I'm getting attacked with
Hmm.
credit card fraud. It's only a matter of time before they go down the street and they try it with you, Ravi, right? It's
Yeah.
it's it's sort of that constant, like I said, finding its lowest level. So I shut my door,
Hmm.
they're going to go down the street and try it with somebody else.
Yeah, totally agree with that, Brian. And again, I always think that people assume that where it is only the uninitiated who typically get attacked more about fraud, which is probably true. But there have been instances, even though I am within the ecosystem of fraud, and I know majority of the modus operandi of fraudsters, but I still there was an instance where I was almost. And at the last moment, because one of the words that the fraudster used kind of triggered me. I'm like, huh? but I had come a long way until then. I knew, and it still happens for us. So I do want people to be aware that it can happen to anybody, even if we are fully aware of fraud itself. It can
Absolutely.
definitely impact us as well. So one last question
Absolutely.
itself before we close the session is: I see that your experience has been predominantly in audit in your first part of your career, like almost 18 years in internal audit, and then you shifted to fraud, right? So I wanted to understand how that shift is, and how that came about, and how you're enjoying the fraud side itself.
So look, I love what I do, and I'm not, this isn't a public service announcement for working at Barclays. I mean, it is a great bank to work for and great people, but for me, I love what I do because
Hmm.
it's always something different. It's everything that we've been talking about.
Hmm.
Fraud's always so not only are the fraudsters always changing,
Hmm.
but the methods for prevention and detection are always changing,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
It used to be rules-based systems. That's all you ever needed.
Yeah.
Now, now it's machine learning models. Now it's how are we stopping generative AI,
Hmm.
things like that.
Hmm.
It's always something different, always something to learn.
Hmm.
So that's always appealed to me.
Hmm.
And that's really what it originally appealed to me with internal
Hmm.
audit, because audit, it's always something different,
Hmm.
right? So,
Hmm.
if you're doing a financial audit, maybe you're learning about, the, accounts receivable, or you're learning about this manufacturing or whatever it is. You're always sort of picking and you're getting a nice view of the organization,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And moving over to fraud, again, sort of appealed to me.
Hmm.
I get bored very easily, right? I always need something new, something different to learn. And
Hmm.
that's why I'm always very careful when somebody will say, "Well, I'm a fraud expert,"
Hmm.
and I sort of cringe, because yes, you can know a lot about fraud, and there are people we both know, I'm sure,
Hmm.
that have
Hmm.
an unbelievable level of experience and knowledge. But there's always something new to learn. There's always a nuance. There's always something different. That's what I like about it the most, right? It's
Hmm.
no 2 days are ever the same working in fraud, as I'm sure you know.
Yeah, wonderful. So, I mean, on that note, I think really thank you, Brian. And again, I do echo a lot of the points that you did talk about. Fraud seems very, very dynamic, and it appeals to my nature as well. That
Yes.
it's always something new to learn. There's a new fraudster. There's a new type of fraud. It's always, and also it also impacts a lot of people. I see a lot of victims, and it also has a lot of societal impact, and also the impact on the victims itself. And I do think people like you being in this space is a humongous help for banks as well as the end customers as well. And thank you so much, Brian, for the insights and also your time. And would love to have you again on the podcast sometime. Thank you so much, Brian.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ravi. This was great. I love talking about fraud and catching up with you. Yeah, so happy to do it again.
Thank you, Brian. Nice to see you again. Bye.